All right, I think we're officially starting class now. I think I've got the roll. I'll double check before we go if you want to. So it's review day. Yay for review day and the last day of class, which is sad. And I appreciate you guys hanging in there this semester. And who knows, maybe we'll all be in person in the fall. Looks pretty promising. I know that's the plan. All right, so we're going to go over the weekly questions a bit. Oh, we could go over the wait, do we really need to go over document analysis? I didn't even think about it, but we'll go over the questions, maybe the documents, then the review for the quiz, and then if you guys have any individual questions, please ask. You can ask them along the way too. I'm not telling you, wait till the end. You can ask whatever. All right, so analyzing the arguments of the Free Soil Party, if you choose that one, that one's a pretty concise, precise. I know you have the page numbers on the notes. So just make sure on that one that you talk about when it started, because it's a history class, we like dates. So when it started, why it started, what was the main goal of the party, what were their beliefs, party platform, that sort of thing. If there are names of people, which there are, who might have been instrumental in the founding of the party, you could talk about them as well. And talk about how they were different than just your traditional abolitionists. These were folks, of course, that wanted to prevent the spread of slavery, further spread of slavery. But the reason for it was this idea of manifest destiny, the idea that the land from east to west coast, sea to shining sea, for the rapidly expanding millions in the United States, was really intended by God, of course, for white people. So if you allowed slavery to spread to the West and slavery ended, which it eventually would, then it might be possible for non-white people to get title to some of that land, which these folks were sure God did not intend. So this is a really odd party that wants to prevent the spread of slavery because, for essentially racist reasons. So I think it's peculiar, kind of interesting. So how does slavery fit into their platform? So you'll have a discussion of that. This one is going to be, if you answer this one, this is going to be shorter, but you have got to use examples from the book on this one. And I gave you page numbers. So just make sure you, use those and you'll be good. Yeah, it'll be fine. But you're probably going to have to put in everything you can find about it. Also, I'm still going to caution you against going online and just randomly finding stuff to put in there, because I know, and even if you go to like history.com or something, I know they're fairly reliable sources, but there's a reason I ask you to get the book and a reason to use it, because Dr. Foner is an incredibly reliable history source who signed his work, so we know who he is. So that reliability and credibility kind of matters, kind of does. Yeah, but use the page numbers in the book. That's really what I'm expecting, so do that. For chapter 14 question, basic premise of the Confederate government, advantages of the Confederacy, and why did leaders think the victory would be theirs? The advantage section, I think, is the most obvious one if you're answering this, and I know that we also put page numbers in for that. On the basic premise of the Confederate government, there's a section in chapter 14 that talks about how the Confederacy Constitution was pretty similar, but the government actually ends up being more authoritarian than the U.S. government. So, okay, question. Let me look. Okay, yeah, good luck on the computer thing. No, sorry. Excuse me. So, I'm trying to see if, I don't know that we had a page number about the Confederate government, but I would mention that at a certain point in the war, they began the practice of confiscation, and that they weren't very respectful of private property or individual rights, that sort of thing. I'm looking for page number. although you can find it. I know that you can. I have confidence in you. But I would definitely mention, in addition to that section where it talks about advantages and disadvantages, I would definitely talk about confiscation, that sort of stuff. Confederate nation, there it is. So 546, where it talks about leadership in government. That's probably a good place to look. And then it goes, it's got a lot of pictures and it's got some other stuff in there, but 546 to 553 as well on that. So in this section, it's 546 to 553. I don't know why I got to put a 0 in here. I'm sure you don't know either. I truly don't. All right, so basic premise, Confederate government, and that's going to talk about how the government worked. And then the advantage, disadvantage section we've talked about already, and I think that was just a little bit earlier in the chat. And then if you answer the one for number 15, was Reconstruction a success or failure, something in between? How did you decide it was how did you define success? So, and it gives you some suggestions about all the things that you could discuss. So land policy, did they redistribute any land? Did they give it back to the slave owners? Key legislation during presidential and radical Reconstruction. There you really have to talk about the constitutional amendments, and maybe discuss a Reconstruction plan or two. At the very least, you should mention the radical or military Reconstruction, 5 military districts, that sort of thing. Southern politics, racial and political violence, Northern fatigue with Reconstruction. What I'm suggesting here is that you don't stop with the Johnson administration, that you go into the Grant administration and talk about the kind of declining desire of the North to enforce Reconstruction. And you could also talk about, in the legislation part, you could also talk about the Enforcement Acts or the KKK Act, because, the assumption is that the government really didn't do anything to protect former slaves. Not true for the probably first 2/3 of Reconstruction, but then by Grant's second term, is really clear that the federal government was moving away from supporting the military governors in the South and moving away from protecting Black voters in the South. And I would wrap this up with the compromise or bargain of 1877. That's what I would do with this one. So if you answer this one, the good part of this one is the roadmap's pretty clear. It reminds you of some things to discuss. And I would, you can say it's a complete success or a complete failure if you like, but I think most folks will look at it and say, well, like, this was pretty good. And there were some folks who were very successful in some colleges and people in the government, that sort of thing. And certainly some African Americans who gained wealth. And then there were other things that clearly went poorly. And when Reconstruction ends, there really are no rights protected in the South for former slaves. There really aren't. So in that way, not very much of a success, much more of a failure. But in the, we have something to build on later, and briefly, some good stuff happened. I know it's kind of the story of the United States. We have a good idea, maybe have some good intentions, maybe fulfill them for a while and then kind of back off. Although, in this case, certainly in the modern era, it seems like we're more committed. I know, not complete. It kind of depends on your perspective, doesn't it? But we certainly have made tremendous progress from this era, but you would expect that. If we hadn't, that would be pretty heinous. So, it's good that we made progress. We should acknowledge it, but we should also expect it. So, what else was I going to say that you should probably put in there? Yeah, that's probably enough. Yeah. I feel like there's something. Let me think for a second. All right, I can't think of it. I'll think of it while we're talking about something else, won't I? Probably so. Probably so. All right, let me find the document thing. I didn't open that. I don't know why. Why did I not open it? I know you're not in charge of that. All right, document assignment. I think several of you have already turned this in, but document assignment on this one, author and of the document, I'm pretty sure you know who Abraham Lincoln was. Remember too that when he's writing this in 1865, he's just won re-election, and the inauguration is when he officially takes office, gets sworn in, that sort of thing. So his purpose in writing is thanking, I don't know, what is his purpose in writing? He's giving a speech. He's giving the second inaugural. So he's thanking people for voting for him, or he's really trying to unify the nation, because at this point, it's very clear the North's going to win the Civil War. It's almost over. So his goal here is to talk about the conclusion of the war and make attempts to unify the nation. Intended audience, are the people in attendance at the inauguration, and that tends to be political folks, people who live in Washington, D.C., but it also is the entire country, more indirectly, because people, they're not going to watch on TV because it's 1865, but they're going to read about it in the newspaper, so they're going to know. So the intended audience, small, the immediate audience is smaller, but the larger audience is anybody who can read about it. Type of document, this is a speech. It's a speech. And it's written, Lincoln was pretty good about writing his own speeches. I am not trying to denigrate people who didn't write their own speeches. Sorry. But yeah, because if you don't have that skill, you probably should get someone else to write your speech. I respect that 100%. But Lincoln typically wrote his own speeches and went through several drafts, as most people do who write these sorts of speeches. You also know, in an instance like that, because it's a public speech and it's clearly a historic time period. I know any inauguration is a historic time period, but we're not going to have very many civil wars, thankfully. So this is going to be a pretty unusual situation. So Lincoln also knows that this is going to be one of those things that will be remembered throughout history. So, a little extra pressure, wants to get it right. You know how that is. Yeah, we all know how that is, because we're all going to give a speech right after our country has a civil war. But as far as how does it impact the credibility, I've tried to emphasize, although I think this is one of the things I probably haven't done a brilliant job of this summer. Credibility doesn't necessarily mean that it's true or false. It has some other implications. One is it accurate, is an accurate representation of what was said or written, because it was said publicly, because there is a written transcript of this, because he's a president, because their papers get published at some point, and there's an assumption that a president's work is historical domain, so they keep the copies of it. There's no reason to doubt any of the content of the speech. And then you can talk about the other part of credibility. Is he saying what he means? Is he saying something that he wouldn't normally say because it's private, or is he saying less than what he would normally say because it's public? Is he lying because he's negotiating and he wants what he wants? Probably with Lincoln in a public setting, he's probably saying what he means. He probably is. And in the general message section, section 4, this is where I get onto a little bit if you don't quote the document just a bit, okay? So certainly talk about the general message, but slide in a little quote. I don't mean you have to quote paragraphs of it. And, again, Lincoln's my favorite speechwriter because his speeches are always short. So that's another bonus of a Lincoln speech. And I do, I thought about this later. I give you 2 documents with Bible verses. So sorry, it really isn't Sunday school. But, again, very common for the time period, very common for the time period. And you still, see that in some areas of the country, although not nearly as much. And the assumption also is during that time period that the one book that everyone has read is the Bible. I don't think that's an accurate assumption in the modern era. I still think we don't read books. Then they didn't read books because they were expensive. Now I don't know why we don't read books. We read other stuff, right? Online stuff, short stuff. Okay. And significance of the document, why is it important? Weaknesses or strengths in the document, any historical reasons to doubt or trust it. So, and on that one, you're probably going to talk more about significance because it's the end of the Civil War. Everybody knows it's the end of the Civil War. Plus, Lincoln's really signaling to the people who are listening or reading that his goal is not to further punish the South, that the South has likely been punished enough from the war. And, it's the North's fault there's a war as well, because the North didn't do anything to stop the war. Yeah. So, and again, nice short speech. So there we go. All right. And I always think the interesting part is, and Lincoln was pretty consistent about this, that people wanted to say that God was on their side. And, he mentions that both sides in the war said that God was on their side. And his famous quote is that he was more concerned about whether he was on God's side than whether God was on his side. Can we go over the review? I think we are. And we're just about to go over some more stuff, I think. And also remember that, yeah, that's definitely on the agenda. I'm sorry, I maybe was misunderstanding the question there for a second, but yeah, we're headed there. We're going there. All right. But I think this one's pretty straightforward. And I think what I've learned from class this semester, because you always want to try a few different things, and I did, is to be more aware of how many Sunday school lessons I'm giving you. I really didn't mean to, but I thought about it later. It's like, because I know, a couple of you have said, in your comments, it's like, really? And I went, yes. But it does, historically, it does matter. So that's going to be my justification, which is legitimate, but I get your concern as well. All right, here we go. Stuff that we want to study. Let's see, reasons for Texas independence. So, I know the book talks about how there were certain things that people did not appreciate about the Mexican government as the ruling over Texas. And of course, the two big things are Catholicism and slavery. But, it is more than that. And I know I think in the first talk about it, it's like, yeah, they're just a bunch of whiners. But that's not exactly what's going on. One, they're really far from Mexico City. So having good, consistent government was sort of problematic for Texas. So they felt like they really weren't being well governed because of the distance. And it talks about, let's see, Moses Austin getting the land grant, then he dies, and they come. Mexico abolished slavery, but local authorities allowed the Americans to bring slaves with them. So that was an issue of conflict. And then Santa Anna's army comes to kind of get people under control, and then people rejected that and pushed back. But it is really kind of the overall, we don't think the Mexican government is serving the needs of the rapidly growing Texas population. So, and let's see. And it does mention that initially the Tejano and the Anglo soldiers worked together because it was good for them economically. And then it does mention that after Texas becomes an independent government, that the Tejanos don't fare quite as well in the government. It does mention that. All right, reasons for Congress to favor and oppose the Mexican War. This really has to do with manifest destiny and where the land is going to be gained. So Mexican War is 1846, goodness, to 1848, and with the Treaty Guadalupe Hidalgo in 49. And also I know the book talks about this too. I know I didn't mention it in class. The US government, the president, also makes an attempt to purchase California, offers to purchase California from Mexico, and they're not terribly interested in that. So there's a lot of stuff going on. So we definitely want more land. That's, a big reason for the Mexican War. And the offers to purchase the land from Mexico are rejected. So reasons, let's see. As far as favoring it to expand the government to get land that we wanted to enhance trade, mostly they wanted California and that little kind of disputed border area in Texas, but there were really important trade routes that went through New Mexico. And, certainly at this point, there were the Mormon folks who had moved from New York to Ohio, Illinois, Missouri, and then, it went poorly all those places. So they end up starting a colony in Utah, which is part of Mexico as well. But trade routes were important. Most of those places weren't heavily populated. California, of course, being the exception. After gold is discovered. And it was because it was coastal. There were certainly more people there than the rest of that region, but mostly we wanted the land. So, and manifest destiny. God wanted us to control all that land. Reasons to oppose it. Most of the new land's going to be in the south. So most of the opposition comes from the north, because what they see, with the Missouri Compromise line is if this land is gained, then the South is going to gain more power. There's not going to be a whole lot of population in these states, but it doesn't stop everybody from getting two senators. So it's going to give a huge advantage to the South in the Senate. And, you have to have the House and the Senate both to pass bills. And the Senate gets to approve presidential appointments. So, and the Senate has longer terms. They have the 6-year term. So they tend to be seen as the upper house or the more powerful house. So having an advantage there is going to be really good for the South, really bad for the North. So slavery, yeah, there it is. Which affects politics, which affects trade policy, which affects, all of that stuff. Changes in political parties. I know we've talked about this a bunch, perhaps. You remember that the Democrats were the pro-Jackson party for quite a while, 12 years. And then after Jackson's and Van Buren are phased out, being the Jackson party doesn't work as much anymore. The Whigs had formed as the anti-Jackson party, so it works even less for them. And they had talked also about how it's positive liberal state versus negative liberal state. You may remember that from the textbook, you may not, but positive liberal state was the Whigs. They had the idea that the federal government should use its power to enact certain changes. The Democrats had the negative liberal state idea that the federal government should stay out of things to allow state and local governments to make these changes. So both favored change, they just favored it at different levels. Whigs thought national power should enact change. Democrats thought local power, state or local power, was kind of their defining principle outside of we like Jackson, we hate Jackson. But when Jackson goes away, it does kind of change the party. So the Whigs start to notice the split in pro and anti-slavery folks, so they're going to disappear. You see the beginning of the Free Soil Party and the Liberty Party at the same time. All of those groups kind of coalesce into the Republican Party, and they'll be the first party to have anything that looks like a civil rights belief in their platform. The platform's the statement of beliefs and things they might potentially work toward if they were to be elected. So the Republicans opposed the spread of slavery, and the Democrats did not. And because of that, they're going to absorb the Whigs and the anti-slavery Whigs will go to Republicans. The pro-slavery Whigs will go to Democrats. The Free Soil and the Liberty Party folks, I didn't mention the Liberty Party, but they want, what you expect. They want the end of slavery. Those guys will end up in the Republican Party. And the Know-Nothings or American Party folks, they just hate immigrants. And they tend to be more of an urban party than a rural party. And they're not overly absorbed by, their beliefs don't fit into either party, or they fit into both parties. Kind of depends on how you would look at it during this time period. Eventually, more of those folks will become Democrats, but it's not because the Democrats embrace those beliefs more than Republicans do. It's just that for a variety of reasons, immigrants tend to favor Democrats. Yeah. And that's still kind of true. Well, not immigrants, excuse me, the cities, people who live in the cities tend to favor immigrants. And these people lived in the cities. Now, it is sort of weird because immigrants also tended to favor Democrats during this era. That's different in different eras. Yeah. All right. But I would, about the Know-Nothings, just know that they didn't like immigrants. Just know that. And you should be good there. It's their main thing. Yeah, I think that's it. Because I don't think my goal was to confuse you about the different coalitions that turned into Republicans. I'm pretty sure that wasn't my goal. All right. And I would just make sure that you have a general idea of these events that lead to the Civil War. You've got, and I didn't really put that in there, but you've got the, the end of the Mexican War. So you gain all this land in the South, and then you have the Compromise of 1850, which puts in some fairly unpopular ideas. Something weird on me. I don't know where I got it. Sorry, got distracted, didn't I? So Compromise of 1850, which fugitive slave law, which irritates some folks. You've got the California coming in as a free state and popular sovereignty in other places. So the popular sovereignty in other places leads to Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is Stephen Douglas getting ready for his run as president, and leads to Bleeding Kansas, which is the mini-Civil War, and kind of a precursor to the Civil War. The Sumner Brooks event, where Preston Brooks, Keynes, Charles Sumner, over the head in the Senate chambers, and then both get reelected. And it's really kind of a sign of how violent the division is becoming. The Dred Scott decision, which is 59. And at that point, the Supreme Court has said that African Americans don't have rights as citizens, and Dred Scott can't be a citizen, and individual states can't limit slavery. So that's sort of problematic. And then John Brown, who says, you know what, we'll just take over a federal arsenal and we'll take care of this business ourselves. And of course, he and his men get captured and either killed or executed. And then he gives the speech where he talks about his blood and the blood of his sons being mingled with the blood of slaves to end slavery in the United States. And that's in 1860. And then Lincoln gets elected. And it's on. Okay. All right. Oh, Roger Taney, the judge on the Dred Scott decision, goodness, history. Yeah, that dude is not well remembered historically. There's a statue of him. I suppose there would be somewhere because he was a Chief Justice, but there's no one who looks at him historically and says that was a good dude. That guy made some good decisions. He's the one that also was going to be the Secretary of the Treasury and moved all the money out of the federal treasury into the pet banks or state banks for Andrew Jackson. So I don't know anyone that thinks that dude was okay. Maybe people from his home state. I don't know. But yeah, Roger Taney, he's kind of a mess. Yeah, for sure. No, and the statue thing, that gets interesting and controversial and stuff. Yeah, I know. I listened to all my more conservative friends, and I think we've all discovered I'm a little more in the middle than left or right. But my more conservative friends, it's like, if you remove the statues, how does anyone learn history? It's like, first of all, I teach history, and I can guarantee you very few people learn history because I don't know I think you guys are doing physics or something during class, but the way people learn history is to learn it so they can pass the test. And then once the test is over, they forget about it. And it had nothing to do with a statue somewhere. Now, I get that public history and statues, I get it. I mean, it can be helpful and remind you of stuff. But, it also usually, if we have a statue, it's meant to honor something or revere something. So, yeah, I don't know that we necessarily want statues of things that are super negative. But then it gets also tricky. I mean, it's Texas, we have Confederate heroes monuments in places. And, if you want to remove them and put them to a less prominent place, maybe. I don't know. I'm not really cool with mobs of folks doing stuff or groups of folks, but I am really cool with people having elections about it or conversations about it. But I'm just weak that way. Yeah. All right. Yeah, I just get nervous about it. That's why I can't watch those movies where there's violence. So yeah, that's why I'm not in charge of stuff either. But I also understand people's frustration at something that's historically offensive being honored. So that is tricky as well. But then, I don't know, it's complicated stuff. I don't want to talk about it anymore, so I'll stop. All right. But yeah, Roger Taney, I don't know why anybody likes Roger Taney. And yeah, I'm supportive of getting rid of his statue. Yeah. Or at least moving it. Move it, put a little, I don't know, blanket over it or something. All right, Roger Taney. It is weird, yeah. It's a good reminder to us, though, that values change pretty dramatically over time. I can't imagine we'd have a dude like that as Chief Justice, but some people are not thrilled with the one we have. All right, Chapter 14, Civil War. I put a plus in there. I don't know why. I'm sure it was a typo. Civil War, so advantages and disadvantages for both sides. I know that we've talked about that fairly extensively. The North has most of the advantages on paper: more folks, more money, established army, established military, established foreign policy, international recognition as a country. The South doesn't have that. South really doesn't have a well-established military, but they have really pretty solid military leaders. Their civilian government's a little iffy because they're just starting it. They don't have as much money. They do have the strength of the cause. They got more cotton. I don't know how much of an advantage that is, but they definitely have more cotton. And I would kind of stay away from thinking that the North definitely has most of the manufacturing. They do. The South is going to build some manufacturing plants, primarily to produce stuff for the war. But try to convince yourself that the South didn't grow all the food in the country, because they're going to end up with food shortages in the second half of the war. It's a big problem for them. And I'm not saying they didn't grow any food. I'm just saying food wasn't their cash crop. You know what I'm saying? They grew cotton. You know, and you shouldn't eat cotton. And they couldn't get the plantation owners to switch in large measure from growing cotton to growing food, which would have really helped the war effort. But they made so much money in the past growing cotton, they just figured, well, the cotton market will pick up again, we'll make a bunch of money. I'm sure they wanted to make money to help the cause, maybe, I don't know. But anyway, so the North had most of the advantages, but the South won most of the battles for the first couple of years because they're fighting a defensive war, better military preparedness, leadership probably. And the North has a hard time deciding on who will be in charge. They eventually pick Grant. Your book says it's because he's willing to fight a war of attrition. He can put up with high casualty numbers, which is going to happen in this kind of combat. It just is. Yeah, a lot of face-to-face, hand-to-hand stuff. They're close to each other. Yeah, it's rough stuff. All right. Not that there's any nice combat. Of course not. Key battles in the Civil War. I would just have a vague familiarity with why these battles matter. Bull Run is the first official battle of the Civil War. Antietam is the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. Yeah, and I don't know. I think because people mostly just have general history classes, you never hear anybody say Antietam. So when you look at it, you go like, Antietam, what is that? Okay, so bloodiest battle of the Civil War. Gettysburg is one of the first kind of major, I thought, and maybe Antietam was to that point. I don't know, you guys can look that up while I'm talking about it. I am pretty sure I don't have a question about Antietam, if that makes you feel any better. And maybe Gettysburg was after that. Oh gosh, I told you I wasn't military historian. I'm not even close, am I? So I'm not trying to make an excuse. I apologize if I'm wrong about that. It certainly is never my goal. Gettysburg, first marginal victory, really bloody battle, marginal victory for the North, and of course, dedication of the cemetery, Gettysburg Address, and that's around the time that you also have the Emancipation Proclamation around that era. Vicksburg is where the General Grant defeats or gets control of the Mississippi River. Sherman's March to the Sea is an example of total war in the South and pretty brutal stuff. And Sherman's the same guy that redistributes the land to the former slaves. So, we can remember him in a positive way for that. And then oh my gosh, he practiced total war on people that are, I know it was a civil war, but people are part of the same country. So people did think of him as fairly brutal in that era. I don't know that anyone really thinks of him in the modern era. And except in Georgia, they still think about him. Yeah, he is not popular there. And Appomattox Courthouse is where Lee surrendered. All right, the amendments, you have to know the amendments. I've said that 82,000 times. So 13th frees the slaves. The 14th provides citizenship to former slaves. And then 15th allows former slaves to vote. So free citizens vote, as one of you shared. So thank you for doing that. And there's a logical progression to that as well. You may want to remember, just kind of tuck it in your brain. It's not a direct question, but it helps you make some sense out of some of the stuff. The 13th Amendment passes before the Civil War is over. So the South doesn't have an opportunity to join in on that. That's just imposed on them. That also ends slavery in the North, which still happened in those border states. So slavery everywhere ends at the end of Civil War in the South and the North. 14th and 15th happen after the Civil War, so those are initiated by the Congress after, and those are required. The South has to ratify those if they want to get their right to run their own state back. And none of the Southern states ever ratify the 14th and 15th Amendment. Now you have some really weird folks. I was passing judgment, wasn't I? who will argue that because Southern states never ratified the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, that they don't really apply to the South. Please don't ever be that person that argues that, because you may think that you have some clever political point or legal point, but then people just see you like they're going to see the court that freed Bill Cosby yesterday. It's like, oh my gosh, you do have a legal point, but dang, that's heinous. So yeah, gosh. All right, Lincoln's Reconstruction Plan versus Wade Davis. So we got 10% versus 50%. Lincoln's was much more conciliatory. Can I say that? Conciliatory. He wanted to be nicer to the South. His thought was the war's over. We need to rebuild. We need to unify. Congress is going to reject Lincoln's plan. Lincoln will reject Congress's plan, that Wade Davis. And remember that he did the pocket veto for that plan. And so he let it expire. And his thought was, of course, cooler heads will prevail after we come back from the recess and inauguration and the war's over, which they assumed, it would be, or, it would be almost over by that point. So maybe there would be less desire for revenge and more desire for peace at that point. But Lincoln gets assassinated, then you've got Andrew Johnson as president, who pardons all the former Confederates, and then it's just a mess when Andrew Johnson becomes president. All right, and then goals and sentiments of Lincoln's second inaugural. I'm really unconcerned about that, since you have to do that before you document assignment. But just remember that Lincoln is going to mention that both the North and the South are at fault for the Civil War. The South more, and he does say that in the document, but the North as well, because the North didn't do anything to prevent the Civil War. They could have ended slavery a long time ago. They just were not strong enough politically to do it. So they didn't, and you ended up with a Civil War. He's going to say the time for fighting has stopped, and it's time to bind up the nation's wounds and care for the orphan and the widow, and yeah, some nice prose in there. Yeah. All right. Oh, good. A comment. Let's see. Yeah. All the North did. Did you guys look up the Gettysburg thing? I can look it up really quick too. You guys, yeah. But yeah, all the North did. The North was, kind of in a weak spot politically. I don't mean that they didn't have the power. They didn't have leadership that wanted to take stands on things. Well, the last guy who wanted to take a stand on anything was Andrew Jackson, and it was about the National Bank and Native American policy, and those weren't really the stands we wanted people to take. Okay, I'm looking up bloodiest battle. It just comes right up. Okay, maybe I've looked it up before. My phone says it was Antietam. Oh, I got it now. I got it. It's the bloodiest one-day battle. There's more casualties in one day. Oh, goodness. So it's the single bloodiest day of the. Okay, I will remember that for my next class. Oh gosh. There's all kinds of stuff about this on the internet. Yeesh. So Gettysburg overall, and then Antietam's the one day. Okay. Can we say we're both right? Is that cool? No, Jonathan, you're more right than me. Okay. So good job. All right. Where were we? Oh, do you guys have any other questions or comments before we go on? You guys happy? Everything's good? All right. Civil War was pretty heinous stuff. I know that was, whenever we get a president my high school students didn't like, which was, regularly in the last 6 or 8 years, because there was always somebody that didn't like Trump, and then there were a bunch of people that didn't like Biden either. And it's like, and the kids were like, oh, the country's going to fall apart. It's like, no, I mean, we had an actual civil war and survived that. So, a really bad president in your estimation will probably be okay. Yeah, I know the really bad president thing disturbs you. Um, I don't know how much more you need to know about the inaugural address. I mean, remember, you're reading it for your document assignment. So just know what we talked about. And really, I mean, he doesn't say it, it's a really short, you saw it, it's really short. He really does just say, you know, when we first time I gave a speech like this, we were about to have a war. It was terrible. We had no idea what was going to happen. Now I'm giving my second one, and the war's about to be over, and you know it's time for us to get back together. And you know, you may want to place blame, but if you look at it rationally, fairly, what you'll notice is both sides are at fault here. Maybe the South more than the North, but we've fought more in the South. More of the difficulty is going to occur for the South naturally. Let's just kind of try to reunify and put it back together and strive for peace as we move forward. So, really short. It's not quite as short as my little rendition of it, but it's not much longer. So, yeah, I won't put quotes or anything in there. Yeah. All right, land redistribution, Sherman. I vaguely remember that there's a direct question about Sherman's Field Order 15. So you want to remember that Sherman is the one who thought that did redistribute land in the middle of this, not the middle, toward the end of the Civil War, of course, but while the war was going on. And the former slaves, recently freed men, who ran these farms in the Sea Islands and in the Carolinas and Georgia, were incredibly successful and had great profit. And you know, why wouldn't they be good at running the farm? Because honestly, they did it before. They may not have handled the paperwork end, but they did the manual labor end, and they understood how to plant the stuff and when to plant it and how to take care of it. So, you know, it worked out fairly well for the slaves, former slaves. And then when Johnson becomes president, he rescinds those orders and returns all of that land to the former plantation owners. So you have a pushback on the beginnings of land redistribution. And there's also a pushback on funding the agency that would have managed land redistribution, the Freedmen's Bureau. So Johnson's definitely opposed to that, refuses to refund it at the levels Congress initially passed, and then Congress will pass a lower level of funding, which he'll also veto, but then Congress will override that. So, yeah, all right. Important successes and failures of the Freedmen's Bureau. So certainly it did not become the agency that redistributed land because Johnson, you know, said we're not going to do that. And there wasn't enough push in the Congress to insist on that and be able to override a veto if they pass such a law. Successes, typically we see the successes of the Freedmen's Bureau as basic literacy for African Americans in the South, basic health and hygiene for for everyone in the South. Really, it's a lot of it's about cleaning up battlefields, and sanitary commissions also help with that, and reuniting families. So teaching folks how to read, basic literacy, basic sanitation, and reuniting families. Biggest successes of the Freedmen's Bureau. Yeah. And they'll have public schools for kids and adults at least during Reconstruction. After that, yeah, not so much. Okay. Laws regarding Reconstruction. Notice how I keep mentioning the Civil War amendments. Be sure that you know the Civil War amendments, but I would also know, it mentions them specifically, KKK and Enforcement Acts, and know the general Reconstruction plans. Know that, you know, Lincoln was going to be especially lenient with the 10% plan. The Wade Davis plan was going to make it to where that current generation of voters, 50% of them had to say they never voluntarily supported the Confederacy, which wasn't going to happen. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't possible. So he's essentially creating a system that wouldn't allow Southerners to vote for a generation or so. Generation of voters, I don't mean, 10 or 15 years, but I do mean 4 or 8, which is a couple of presidencies. So it's kind of a big deal. And the North seemed to manage that with Reconstruction anyway. Then Johnson's Reconstruction plan really just was pardon everybody and let them do what they want in the South. And then congressional Reconstruction is 5 military districts, and you can't reconstruct your own state until you ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments, which never happened, by the way. Okay. So I would just know your basic Reconstruction plans. Okay. Successes and failures of Reconstruction, that's also the question, isn't it? The essay question, if you want to think of it that way. So your plan here is to think about things that worked, things that didn't work. I mean, the book has a nice number of statistics that remind you that hundreds and probably close to 1,000 African Americans participated in their state governments. Certainly a handful at the federal level and many, many more at the local level. So if you added local, state, and federal together, it would easily be thousands of African Americans participating in government, getting to vote. Historically Black colleges being created during this time period or enhanced. Hampton was there before, of course. Certainly some economic progress, but economic progress is where you're going to see the least amount of change or success because there's no redistribution of land or assets. And I know sometimes when you hear that, you go like, that's socialism. Oh dear. Redistribution of assets, yeah, that part of that is socialism, but not in this instance because, I mean, my assessment, you don't have to agree with it, but people had been owned, they didn't get paid. So it wasn't, if you work hard and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, slaves didn't own the boots. You know what I'm saying? So if you rob someone generationally of their wages, and then you say, okay, now you're free, they have no assets and they have no money, and you end up in the sharecropping system where I mean, you don't even own the little slave quarter thing that you worked in, and now you got to pay rent for it, and you don't have any money, and you don't technically own the tools that you've used your whole life. And, again, not through your own fault. There's nothing at all that you could do about any of this stuff. So when you start fresh, start new, and you have no assets and you have no ability really to get any sort of better job, and also your movement is restricted. The book talks a lot about Black codes. You're not going to be able to move to another place, sometimes by law, but other times you're limited by your lack of assets. So even if they're giving you free land in Kansas, which they were giving out free land in Kansas for former slaves, it's going to be hard to get there. Now, in that instance, there probably was going to be some support for you to get there, but you'd have to take your whole family because people typically don't want to move so far away from their family that they'll never see them again. Some of you go, no, that's what I want to do on purpose. No, don't be, okay, no, do whatever you want, of course. But yeah, if you don't have any money, you can't move. It's just the truth. And it's still true too. It's a little different. I know we have different options and opportunities now, but any of you who've moved ever, one, it's a ton of work. Plus two, you got to move all your stuff. And three, first and last month's rent. Even that is a chore to come up with. Or if you're buying a house, a down payment. So money, we need it for everything, it seems. All right. And I would always argue, I know I've probably overemphasized this, that the biggest failure of Reconstruction is you freed a bunch of folks, but they have no assets. So it's really hard for them to get started. And I know they get basic literacy, but that just keeps them poor like the white folks who are poor in the South. Yeah, it is tricky, it's hard. Yeah. But you do see some incredible successes. So I do recognize there's always that percentage of folks that no matter what the situation, they're gonna probably make it. But, that's most of us kind of need, I don't know, some education or if you're like Donald Trump, a small loan of $1 million from your father, which I know in business sense probably isn't that much money. It looks pretty impressive to those of us who teach history. Yeah. All right. Goodness. I'll ask my father for a small loan of $1 million. All right. You could ask me for a small loan of $1 million. That probably wouldn't happen either. Okay. Johnson's impeachment. I think we talked about this maybe too much yesterday, but Johnson was annoying to Congress. He vetoed their stuff. They tended to override his vetoes. He would come in and cuss them out. They wanted to get rid of him. For better or worse, he wouldn't do illegal stuff. So they couldn't really impeach him. So they passed a law, the Tenure of Office Act, TENURE, which essentially said if you were appointed to a position that was approved by the Senate, then the president couldn't fire you without Senate approval. And they passed that because they knew Johnson was about to fire Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War from the Lincoln administration, the last Lincoln advisor there. And they thought, well, we'll pass this law, we'll catch him, and then we can impeach him, which they did, and they did. And Johnson thought, unconstitutional law, I'm just going to do what I want to do. And he did, and he got impeached, but not convicted, as we discussed. Yeah. So he missed his conviction by one vote. I don't know if I emphasized that yesterday, but I know that I told you that there were, I think it was 6 Republicans who said we're not going to vote for the conviction, and that he missed conviction by one vote. And it was the last year of his 4-year term. He didn't plan to run again, and that's part of the reason those guys backed off. The KKK and enforcement acts are passed, I think they're 1870, but the KKK rose up. Their initial goal was to keep African Americans in the South from voting, but they're certainly going to do other stuff, and their methods are violent. So the KKK Act allows the regional governors, district governors, to call for military support to put down the KKK, to protect Black voters during elections, that sort of thing. And they were fairly successful at suppressing the KKK during that era. And then we had the KKK talk, which there definitely no what does the KKK do later questions, but they do, they're kind of suppressed and they resurface, suppressed, resurface. I'm kind of hoping we're done with them. I am hoping we're done with them. Yeah. So I think bankrupting them was probably the final act for them as a large organization. I do recognize, I promise, I recognize there's still folks who are KKK members and white supremacists. My dad and his wife, it's not funny, it was really weird. They said they were traveling somewhere and they stopped at a small diner or something to have breakfast, and they were at the counter and they noticed in the back there was a meeting, and it got kind of loud in the back of the restaurant. And you could hear them talking, and my dad said it was a KKK meeting. It's like, it's weird to think that that kind of stuff still goes on in the modern era, but it does. And I recognize it's a very tiny percentage of the population, but still pretty amazingly bad. Reconstruction difficulties in the Grant administration. The book will certainly chronicle some of the difficulties of the Grant administration. There's lots of corruption, scandals, bribery, fake holding companies, Grant being sick, that sort of stuff. So it's, the Klan meeting, that was, yeah, it wasn't super recently, but it's been like last 10 or 15 years. So historically recently, if it makes you feel any better, it wasn't in Texas. It was in Ohio. And I think one of the weird things, if you study Klan activity, I don't know why you would, but again, I had the 2 points of emphasis in my master's degree, and one was about stuff in the 1950s, so it came up. You'll notice that a lot of the more organized Klan activity happens in the upper Midwest. It's the corn growing states, Indiana, Iowa, Illinois, Ohio. Yeah, and it's really weird to think about, but it's true. Yeah, yeah, weird stuff. All right. So Grant administration, Grant's personal secretary took bribes to get access to Grant so people could get access. The Secretary of the Interior took bribes. No, it was the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, took bribes so that people could get contracts to sell things on reservations. And then there was a holding company created by some congressmen and I think some cabinet members as well, to bid on railroad contracts that were funded by the federal government. And so they would bid on contracts and then award them to their own company, which is incredibly highly illegal in an era where nothing's illegal. So it was messy stuff. So there's a general feeling that this government is corrupt, even though Grant personally probably is not, plus Grant's attention is really taken away from his presidency that last term because he's very ill and he's worried about taking care of his family, so he's writing his memoirs. So what happens is the federal government loses whatever desire they had to enforce Reconstruction. The people in the North who felt strongly about it are no longer involved in politics. Plus, you've got this influx of all this new money that the book starts to talk about in this chapter, where industrialists start to consolidate their fortune and become these mega multi-millionaire Bill Gates-like dudes from the time period, Rockefeller and Carnegie and Vanderbilt and JP Morgan and all those other dudes. So that influx of money really starts to impact the political process and the goals of the political parties. So both parties kind of become interested in getting that money and being a lot more pro-business than pro-reconstruction. So in the election of 76, which you want to kind of refresh your memory about, you have the Hayes-Tilden thing. Tilden wins the popular election. Hayes ends up winning the electoral count, but in a disputed situation. So it ends up being pushed to the House of Representatives, which is the constitutional way to handle a disputed election. But they make a committee. The committee votes along party lines. And what the Democrats get out of this is the end of military reconstruction. Now, it is in exchange. I didn't mention this because it really is not very meaningful. And I may have forgotten. We'll go with that. Both of those are actually true. The bargain of 1877 makes, or is it bargain of 1877 in your book or a compromise? But either way, makes Hayes president, who's the Republican. The South gets a Southern Democrat in the cabinet, so it's essentially the Democrats, postmaster general. A railroad from Texas to California, which really is beneficial for commerce, but the main thing is the end of military reconstruction. The troops were moved from the South in exchange for a promise by the South that they would uphold the civil rights of African Americans in the South. No one believed that was going to happen. But at this point, the federal government didn't care anymore. The state government had already been pushing back against this. So at this point, if the federal government's not going to enforce laws, the state governments never did. And now the state governments can do whatever they want. They don't have the 5 military districts anymore. They don't have the military government. So the South is going to go back to what they did before as much as they can. And while they don't have slavery, they do have sharecropping, and they do have black codes, and they do have Jim Crow laws. So they're going to be able to separate, segregate. And remember too, the little discussion in the notes of ways they kept blacks from voting before this. After this, they don't even have to pretend, you know. And you won't see African American voter participation for 80 to 90 years after this. So I know we're ending this class on a pretty negative historical note, but you know, it is what it is. It's accurate. Yeah. And you know, what will happen after this is the economy will expand so dramatically that becomes the focus of the country, and then we'll use the proceeds from the economy expanding rapidly to build a military, and then we become a major world economic and military power, and that changes our focus for a while, and then some world wars, and then after that, we'll kind of refocus on improving our own country. Although we have the progressive era, the progressive movement, kind of pre-World War One, where we're trying to change things and improve things, but none of that is about ethnic or racial discrimination. For whatever reason, progressives, that was not, they were unconcerned. They were concerned about other stuff. But I want to give you an overview of 1302. Yeah. Plus, you probably already had it if you had a high school class, or if not, you'll take it as your history class next semester. Okay. I feel like I'm done. Yeah. Now, were there other things that you guys want to ask about? And I'll kind of double check the roll here in a sec. Let's see. Illuminati. My gosh. I'm not in charge of that. You're the same guy that has the pet wasp, aren't you? So, oh my goodness. Yeah, the conspiracy, Lee Harvey Oswald and oh my, James Earl Ray and JFK and Illuminati. You know, in this era, we didn't even talk about it. And I'm so sorry. But there's a big conspiracy, the Masonic conspiracy, where they were very sure that the Masons controlled politics in the United States, and they slipped the little pyramid with the eye on it on the money, and they had anti-Masonic parties, and people wrote books about them. And then the guy who wrote the big book wrote the anti-Masonic book gets killed. And so they had similar conspiracies during that era, which had elements of, you know, there was enough sneaky stuff that happened that people thought that it was true as well. I'm not saying that it wasn't. I don't know that Masons controlled the world, but you do notice if you know, they would prove a point that all of the presidents up to a certain point had been members of the Masons, but that's also because it's kind of an exclusive service / social club for wealthier white dudes. So, you know, for most of our history, wealthy white dudes are president. You've noticed, yeah. But also for most of everybody's history, wealthy people control the government, and wealthy, whatever the majority race, ethnicity tends to be. Yeah. Because they're the ones with free time and money. So, you know, free time and money often equals control. Illuminati. I don't know about the Illuminati very much, but they may control all kinds of stuff. Are they tied up with tech people in the modern era? Is Bill Gates part of it? Soros? Okay, Soros is an interesting kind of dude. He surely funds a lot of political campaigns, doesn't he? And did you read the recent article, and then I'll stop talking about all this stuff, about how it's Bill Gates, right, that owns most of the highest percentage of the farmland in the United States, so he's controlling your food source as well. I honestly do get nervous if there's a monopoly on stuff, because you know his stuff, and we don't want some, you know, one person controlling all our stuff. It makes us nervous. Yeah. And we also don't want those sneaky little tech dudes that hack into oil pipelines, oil and gas pipelines, and your meat supply. My gosh, what can we do in the United States without hamburgers? So, all right, I'm definitely going to stop recording, because what can we do in the United States without hamburgers may not be the most brilliant thing I've ever said. Okay.